So the mobilization effort helps them in one capacity. It helps them in manpower. It is literally more bodies to do the work. But at the same time, it doesn't actually impact any of the other concerns that they've had or problems. It doesn't help them with their logistic issues. It doesn't help them help their defense industrial base. And so they're running out of weapons. They've sought to get military equipment from foreign governments that would be willing to deal with them. And so while the mobilization effort will help with the manpower concerns, there are a number of other issues that have been on full display since they invaded that won't necessarily be fixed by just adding more men.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by defense reporter Mike Brest. Mike, Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced a new mobilization of forces, new troops sending to Ukraine. He's trying to regain the momentum that he's sort of lost since the invasion began. Where do things stand right now?
So it's important to contextualize Vladimir Putin's mobilization effort. What we've seen through the month of September is Ukraine launched two different counteroffensive, one in the northeast and the one in the south. The one in the northeast has resulted in significant success. They've taken back thousands of square miles in the northeast region of Ukraine. It really has been not only a surprise, but a game-changing outcome so far for the war. And so, as a result, we've seen Russia act like they should, desperate. And so we've seen that various regions under Russian control within Ukraine have announced referendums. Now, the U.S. And various Western countries have already denounced them and have preemptively warned about these referendum that they call shams. And they've said no matter what happens, they will, always come back in Russia's favor. And it is a ploy to try and get these territories into Russia. And for a lot of these regions, they're now contested. So it's not even clear how exactly these referendums will work. In addition to these referendums, we also saw Vladimir Putin announce a partial mobilization effort of reserve forces. For some context, he called up roughly 300,000 troops, which is almost double the amount that they had on the Ukraine border back in February when the war and the invasion began. It's also important to note that what the U.S. believes about these soldiers has changed drastically from the start of before the invasion to now. The U.S. has watched and the world over the last 7 months, Russian forces suffer from morale issues, suffer from logistics concerns, command concerns, suffer from so many different issues that the thought of 300,000 additional Russian soldiers might not necessarily be as scary as it once was thought to be. And so this effort also demonstrates once again that Putin is sort of backed into a corner at the moment, and he doesn't really have that many options available to him considering Ukraine's success.
So, this does seem to be part of a broader pattern, though, because when Russia initially invaded, the thought was that the Ukrainian government would collapse relatively quickly, that the capital would fall fairly quickly. Those things didn't happen. Russia then began to reposition its troops within Ukraine. It seemed to have limited success in really changing the narrative there. And now there was this counteroffensive by Ukraine. People didn't give it a whole lot of a chance to make major gains in terms of retaking territory, but it actually seems to be somewhat successful. And now Russia is the country that seems to be acting with a certain degree of desperation.
Absolutely. We saw it even at Putin's recent trip abroad, where he met with leaders from the Asian region. We saw him meet with the Chinese president. And in those conversations, we saw a little bit of a division there where there is even concerns among Putin's allies that the war isn't going well.
Because these are governments that have not been particularly critical of what Putin is doing.
Exactly. And so we've seen governments who have been fairly quiet in this regard, ask some questions, raise some concerns, and we've seen even Putin acknowledge that. And so it does demonstrate that it really isn't going well and that Putin's running out of options.
So what can Putin expect to accomplish? So he's already invaded with what one would think would be some of his better troops and better quality forces. is there any reason to think this mobilization, other than maybe the weather conditions are going to start to get less favorable, but is there any reason to think this mobilization will produce anything different?
So the mobilization effort helps them in one capacity. It helps them in manpower. It is literally more bodies to do the work. But at the same time, it doesn't actually impact any of the other concerns that they've had or problems. It doesn't help them with their logistic issues. It doesn't help them help their defense industrial base. And so they're running out of weapons. They've sought to get military equipment from foreign governments that would be willing to deal with them.
Sure.
And so while the mobilization effort will help with the manpower concerns, there are a number of other issues that have been on full display since they invaded that won't necessarily be fixed by just adding more men.
I mean, you've written about, though, how even recruiting mercenaries to come fight in the war has not necessarily gone particularly well.
Absolutely. What we saw within the last couple of weeks is the Wagner Group, essentially mercenaries that Russia uses and have been fighting in Ukraine, have gone to prisons to recruit convicted felons with the allure of freedom after the war if they fight. And a lot of these prisoners have said no. And so it really is just another example of how the sheer manpower is pretty concerning. And what we saw originally was about 160 to 180,000 troops on Ukraine's border. And we heard from DOD in early October that as many as 80,000 troops were either killed or wounded in action, which would diminish their total strength from the beginning 50%.
So closer to home, there have been some problems with recruitment in the major service branches, the military. And the Pentagon is trying to do some things both to make life better for people currently serving, but probably also to make recruitment a little bit more attractive. Talk about that.
Absolutely. So there are a number of different issues affecting the situation, but for service members who are currently enlisted, we're seeing high inflation numbers affecting the people's lifestyles.
Right.
And so DOD announced earlier this week new policies and initiatives to help support those families. It includes things like lowering commissary prices to try and get grocery bills down. It includes expanding resources for service members' spouses' employment, because when you're changing bases and you're moving all the time, it's hard to keep jobs, and when you're certified and having certifications and things of that nature. And so they're really trying to make an effort to enrich service members' lives, and we have seen, and they are acknowledging, a pretty significant recruitment issue going on right now and for the near future. And they blame a number of things, including the pandemic and their inability to recruit at very common events that have been a staple for them, like high schools, like sporting events, community centers. And so they are looking forward to getting back out there. And they also cite an overall decline in personal connections with the military.
So you mentioned inflation, and obviously grocery inflation is a really big issue affecting civilians, but the military has not been exempt or immune from this.
Absolutely. And so DOD even announced that they're trying to cut those prices 25%, which is a pretty firm commitment that they've made. And it's just, again, one effort that they've made both in the past that they've announced in a series of initiatives that they plan on announcing moving forward as well.
Thank you, Mike. You can read Mike and the rest of our national security team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.